Okay. Well, sorry for the technical difficulties. I want to talk to you today about how we should think about what might happen as machines start to supersede humans in terms of intellectual capabilities. So some of this is thinking about like the long run, like where AI is headed. I will not talk about how likely we are to get there, but just sort of what does that path look like. And I spend a lot of time thinking about, will technology replace jobs? And this is a concern people have had for really hundreds of years. Every new technology that comes along, people worry about it taking jobs. But usually what happens is that's a good thing. It does take jobs, but it ends up being a good thing. And I really liked this quote from The Onion that kind of points out the absurdity of being worried that our jobs will disappear. So some of you might say, wait, no, I'm still worried, and I'm worried about what's going to happen to my kids. We are going to talk about it. First, I want to frame what I think are kind of the big questions of artificial intelligence in the big picture, right? There's a lot of small questions that I think are actually quite meaningful and important around how it might change healthcare or science. But let's, at the very big level, is AI going to take our jobs? Is it going to make us rich? How can it make us rich if it takes our jobs? That's a big puzzle. If we get rich, but we have no jobs, will life lose all meaning? So those are kind of the four big questions that I've been thinking a lot about that I want to try to address today. And I want you to think about there being stages of AI taking our jobs. In sort of stage one, we're working with the AI like it's our friend, and it's just sort of helping us out. And economists refer to this as kind of the period where tasks start to evolve. We start to maybe use AI to condense somebody's long CV into a manageable introduction, right? AI, it turns out, is actually quite good at condensing large amounts of information. Or for those of you who teach a lot of students and you get the student evaluations, they're a lot easier to read and think about if you just put them into the ChatGPT and say, what are the 3 biggest things I should work on improving? And what are the 3 things they like the most about me? Instead of getting yourself caught up on the one person who decides to critique your outfit. So that's sort of the first stage, when it's just changing a little bit how we do the things we do. And then the second stage, jobs start to evolve. And our job looks really different because now we do things very differently, and there are new jobs that are coming about, and old jobs start to disappear. Think about how word processing changed the job of typist. I think about that one a lot because during the Great Depression, my grandmother was a 19-year-old woman living at home with her parents, and her father's grocery store, the only store in town, started to fail because it was the Depression. And she decided the only way to save her family business was to move to the big city, Buffalo, and get a job as a typist at a big insurance company. And she used that money to support her family and help her father from losing his business. And I know this not just because my grandmother told me these stories, but you can turn to the census and I could actually see how much money my grandmother made in the census records compared to her father. So typist was a really important job. It's not really a job that exists anymore, right? But that job evolved over many, many decades into office assistant. And even the office assistant job hasn't been static. It has evolved over time to take on more HR functionality, accounting functionality as new software has been added. And what we've seen is today's office assistant is a much better paid job than the typist job that my grandmother once had. Now, the third stage of AI in work is the one we probably are all the most worried about. You can see there's a robot throwing away the human because the human has no longer become necessary. And that's a very different kind of conception, and it's one we haven't seen with previous technologies, right? So with previous technologies, people have become less and less and less necessary, but we've really gotten ourselves into stage 2. Brand new jobs have sprung up, and we've all been kind of happy about the changes. If you want to disagree with me, I'm going to give you one fact, which is in 1850, 60% of Americans worked in agriculture, and today less than 1% do. And most of the people walking around the United States are not saying, boy, I wish I could go back to those days of subsistence agricultural work that my great-great-great-grandparents did, right? They're pretty happy to be doing their much more comfy office jobs. So we really eliminated, not fully eliminated, but dramatically reduced the number of agricultural jobs. But we didn't get to a place where humans were thrown out, because now we have all sorts of jobs, like pet behavioral therapists that people can go to deal with their overly barking dog, right? So there's been a whole bunch of new occupations that have arisen. The question with AI will be, do we actually run out of things to do? So these 3 phases are worth thinking about, because the speed and timing with which we go through them will dramatically change people's experience of how AI changes the labor market. If you think about the invention of the steam engine and electricity, it took nearly 50 years for that to reorganize work. That was a very long time period, which was problematic in its own way, because someone who was born at the dawn of the steam engine ended their life without ever seeing a wage gain or any kind of improvement in standards of living as a result of this miracle technology. This period has been called Engel's pause by the economic historian Robert Allen, and it led to an enormous amount of social upheaval, including the development, the writings of Marx and Engels, which is why this period is called Engel's pause, the ideas, so a lot of social thinking. It also laid the groundwork for the kinds of safety net regulations that we have today. This is where we started to get child labor laws, where we started to get some workplace safety laws. So not the full safety net, but the idea that government should step in and set some rules around how human labor is used came out of this period of time. When electricity came about in 1880, it took almost 30 years for work to be redefined in a way that we could see productivity gains and rising living standards. More recently, personal computers also had a sluggish start. Not as slow as electricity or the steam engine, but maybe 15 to 20 years. And in fact, this one feels to me like, oh, I experienced this, I know this world, because when I was in college, Solow had the famous saying, one can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. IBM got desktops on everyone's desks in the workplace, and the workplace workers didn't seem to get any more productive. So what was the use of that? And as I was like studying under an economist who was focused on productivity, and I went to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., and we're trying to figure out, like, why are we not getting any productivity gains? All of a sudden, we finally figured out how to make computers work for us, so that we started to see productivity gains again at the end of the 1990s. And that was, the late 1990s was, up until the very recent period, the highest employment participation, fastest wage growth that we had seen in a very long time. With AI, the question is, how long will it take? And what can policymakers do to shape that timeline? So there are 2 things I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about how work gets redefined in the age of AI. Is economists think about substitutes and complements. So a substitute, AI is going to displace some workers. A complement, AI might augment others. It's actually very impossible very impossible, or we could just call that impossible, for AI to augment all workers. Because if AI makes you better so you can take on more tasks, if someone else was doing them before, it just made that person's job less needed. And I can go back to that example of the office assistants. The technology, the software that has allowed your typical office assistant to now also do some of your bookkeeping, if you're a small business, manage your HR, process payroll, means that as a small business, you might not need an accountant. You might not need an HR professional because you've got an office assistant who has the software that allows them to do those tasks. So what does that mean? That means the software augmented the office assistant, was a complement to them, and that ended up being a substitute for some other workers. So you can, in teaching a class on this last fall, I said, well, what do you guys think about AI improving the accent of an actor in a movie? And someone said, well, that doesn't bother me because it's not replacing anyone's job, it's just making the accent better. And one of my students raised their hand and said, they used to have accent coaches on set who they think it just replaced their job. So if you push hard on any sort of augmentation, there's somebody down the line that's going to get replaced. So this idea that don't worry as long as the technology augments instead of replaces, I think it's a pipe dream. Now, there's another thought, which you can see in either a glass half full or a glass half empty way, which is that people talk a lot about, can AI do this thing that a human can do? That is not the relevant question. The relevant question is, can technology do something that a human could do cheaper than the human is willing to do it for? There are plenty of people all over the world right now as we speak doing things that machines can do. But they are doing them because they are cheaper than the machine. So what could happen is AI could keep our wages down because we have to work for less than the machines are willing to work. And that, I think, is one of the big fears that people have. Now, don't get yourself too worried, though, because as long as humans are needed somewhere and humans have some agency over whether to work or not work, some outside options, then humans will be the scarce resource, and most of the compensation goes to the scarce resource. So if AI is cheap and plentiful, and humans have lots of opportunities outside of work, you might have to pay humans a lot to work. So it's not clear what necessarily happens to wages, but it is important to realize that it's not whether technology can do the job, it's whether technology can do the job at a price that is less than the human. So, first question, will AI take our jobs? Yes, it will. But what matters is the speed and scope with which it happens. And I think that's actually the place where policy needs to get involved right now. Because human beings are limited in their ability to adapt to change. If you think hard about this, you probably all agree with this. Some people are better at change than others, but change is hard. And it's particularly hard if you've been doing something for a really long time. And so the question is, what is the pace at which we're asking people to try to adapt? And I will give you one example of this, which is that when we went through the pandemic, all these workers were, told to stay home, but there were some that couldn't, right? If you wanted to buy a coffee from Starbucks or get a bubble tea from Bubble Tea, there needs to be a human there. And I had a really hard time hiring humans because humans were getting these great checks that, from being unemployed, so that kept some out of the labor market for a little while. And also people were just scared. They were like, I don't need a low-wage job and get COVID and die. I'm going to stay out of the labor market. So what did a lot of companies do? They actually adopted new technology that allowed people to use, say, an app to order or a kiosk to check out. Well, this didn't really hurt anybody because they weren't laying off workers. And what ended up happening is we saw huge wage gains for the workers they could get in, because now the workers were more productive. Because, if you're placing your order through Starbucks through the app, they got to have somebody make it, and they don't need as many workers to take the orders, but now they really need you to make it, and you're more productive because what you're doing is just making the coffee that is being purchased through the app. And so we saw wages at a large number of sort of our traditional minimum wage jobs get the biggest wage gain we've ever seen, driven by market forces. And some of that was the way in which technology was adopted. So let's move to the next question. Will AI make us rich? Which, more importantly, is it good to be rich? Like, I go to a lot of AI conferences, and these technologists tell me it's going to be amazing, we're going to be so rich. They never really talk about whether that's a good idea or not. So let's talk about that. But first, let's think about will we be rich? So, artificial intelligence promises radical abundance. That's actually a quote, Amodai, unprecedented productivity gains. Elon Musk, everyone can have whatever goods and services they want. No scarcity. No scarcity is a phrase that comes up a lot when you're talking to technology optimists. Now, economists, I'm going to say we tend to be a bit more skeptical about the potential likelihood of such rapid growth because, we're like, where's the bottleneck, and is it going to be plugged or not? And usually there's a bottleneck somewhere, and there's just a limit to the capacity with which people can manage change. But most economists agree that there's the potential for a new era of rapid economic development. And I should tell you why the technologists talk to me about 200% growth each year. Economists are like, we might go from 2% growth to 3% growth, and that would be amazing. And it really would. There's a compounding factor there that means that 3% growth a year forever instead of 2% is pretty awesome. So, okay, we have the potential to get rich from AI. But is that good? Like, how many of you have heard the myth that, money doesn't make us happy? So I say it's a myth because what I want to talk about now is that's a myth. Money does make us happy. So, we do get happy from money. Let's, though, talk about some of these facts about the relationship between happiness and income. So happiness or overall life satisfaction has risen with the log of income in a consistent way across countries, within people, within countries, and over time within countries. So this is a fact. This is like what the whole early part of my research career was on establishing this fact. So I'm going to give you really a sprint through a very, very long literature. So we talk about subjective well-being, which refers to sort of the various types of evaluations people make, positive and negative. I want to refer to life satisfaction and happiness on purpose because I want us to focus on hedonic measures of subjective well-being. Not are you happy in the moment, but hey, how are things going? Are you pretty happy? That kind of happiness. And what we see is that subjective well-being scores are closely correlated with GDP per capita. So this is the World Happiness Report and the World Development Indicators. I pulled this because this is the absolute latest data, which I use in my textbook. And you can also look at holistic measures like the Human Development Index. So it makes us happy for a good reason. We tend to do things like die less, lose our children less, eat more, and be healthier when we have more money. Now let me show you something from one of my papers, which is this is the same relationship for each individual country. So now we're within countries. This is plotting, the average Human Development Index in a country against their gross national income per capita purchasing power parity. This is GDP per capita against the Human Happiness Index. This is life satisfaction. So again, a happiness index plotted against annual household income. Now, what I should have said is in every case, it's the log of income. The log of income is really important here because economists have been saying for hundreds of years that there's diminishing marginal utility. So each additional dollar we get brings us less and less and less. The question is, do we ever start getting anything out of it? And the answer is no. What you can see is these are pretty sharp upward sloping lines. So even if you are a very wealthy person, more money still makes you happier. But keep in mind that you need a lot more money to get a little bit happier if you're starting with a lot more money, right? Because the log puts it in percentage terms. So a 10% increase in my income is going to give me the same boost in happiness whether I'm living off of, $1,000 a year or $1 million a year. But a 10% boost in my income at $1,000 a year is very, very little amount of money compared to $1 million. And I want you to put that together because that also means I could take 10% of the income from somebody on $1 million a year and redistribute that to all the people on way less. And yeah, it hurts the person I'm taking it from. We don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. It does. It just turns out that the pain that they're going to experience is very, very tiny compared to the gain that will happen if I turn around and give a 10% increase, take that same money and give a 10% increase, to people making, say, $1,000 or $10,000 a year, right? I'll be able to spread it across a lot more people, and they'll all get the same increase in happiness that one person lost in happiness. So there's an argument there for redistribution. In other words, this is sort of a fundamental utilitarian framework where people are made, yes, they get made better off by more income, but each additional dollar gives them less and less, which means that average happiness in a society is maximized with an equal distribution. So I'm going to come back to that point, but I'll show you a few more slides really quickly. This is between countries where you see rich countries are happier. And what you can see is that we sort of estimate a slope of the line, which is 0.35. And you saw here the slope is about 0.35. So this relationship between income and well-being, once you get the income on the right scale, it's pretty robust, it's pretty stable, and it's pretty similar, whether we're talking about getting richer within a country, across country, or across time. Why is it that people tend to get happier when they get more money? Well, let's look at some other subjective questions that people are asked. Did you have good tasting food to eat yesterday? Turns out, if you are in a wealthier country, you're more likely to say yes to that. It's not all subjective. There is actually objective differences between a good coffee and a bad coffee. Were you treated with respect all day yesterday? It turns out when you live in a richer country, a higher share of the population says they were treated with respect. I really like to show this one at conferences on AI because people worry like, well, wait a minute. Oh, we get our status from our jobs. And then first of all, I like to point out, you're unusual, right? Like, you're unusual getting your status from your jobs. Most people are not getting their status from their jobs. Sometimes I feel like when a bunch of AI people and economists come together to talk about, whether AI being, smarter than the smartest human is going to decimate us, I feel like we took all the fastest runners in the town and sat around and talked about whether these awful automobiles were going to decimate everybody's status and work, right? Like, we're the wrong people. We're the people totally benefiting from the current system. All the people out there with IQs of 100 might be really welcoming this transition we're about to come into because maybe the status goes to them. But I think I want to think about status in a different way, which is that you can choose who you spend your time with and how people treat you more if you're not fighting to survive. And I think that's fundamentally what's reflected here. Your ability to say, don't treat me like that, I'm out of here, is fundamentally related to whether or not how much that's going to cost you. Is that going to be about whether you get to eat tonight? That's a lot to give up to try to insist on respect. The richer you are, the easier it is for you to make those changes. So there's also a myth out there that there is some amount of satiation. This myth remains really popular but completely unproven, and I just want to show you one thing on that. There is, in my data, again, when we're looking at these hedonic measures like life satisfaction and happiness, what we see is that it's even sharper relationship among richer countries than poorer countries. So what that means is the relationship between satisfaction and the log of GDP, the slope is steeper when we're looking at countries with GDPs over 15,000. And that number was picked because there was a literature claiming that satiation sort of hits around a GDP per capita of 15,000. You can see the quote from Richard Layard up there. I don't want you to, again, I'm just going to keep hammering on the point that relationship between the log of income and life satisfaction still means that redistribution is useful for boosting average levels of happiness. So even though there's 3 times the relationship, the coefficient is 3 times larger when we're looking at richer countries, a 1% rise in GDP has a 3 times larger effect in rich countries than poor countries, but a $100 rise in GDP has a 20 times larger effect in Burundi than in the United States, right? So that is because poor countries are poor and rich countries are rich, and money, when we put it in dollar terms, it takes a lot more money for a rich country to have a 1% rise in GDP than it takes for a low-income country. So will AI make us rich? Probably. Is it good to be rich? Yeah, it is from a hedonic happiness perspective. But I do want to remind you that money is not the only thing that matters for happiness. Money can make you happy. That doesn't mean if you have money, you are happy, right? Those are not the same statements. So how will it make us rich if it takes our jobs? Well, that's a good question, and that's what matters for well-being. The question of whether AI improves the world cannot be divorced from the question of distribution. AI making one person rich is not going to move the needle on global life satisfaction. Might not even move the needle on US life satisfaction, right? If you want to move the needle on life satisfaction, that wealth has to be equally distributed. Now you might say, wait, I'm sure economists have been telling me there's a reason we can't have equal distribution. And you are right. There's an equity efficiency trade-off. And I think one real question is whether AI is going to kill it. Will the equity efficiency trade-off die? I don't have an answer to that, but I do think it's worth asking the question, because for any given level of average income, a more equal distribution means higher average well-being. The equity efficiency trade-off is like why my kid studied math all day yesterday. Oh, and she has a bossy mom. But it's why we work really hard when we'd prefer to be having fun with our friends. It is, go back 200 years, it's why someone stayed up late making candles or canning food to make sure they could get through the winter instead of getting a good night's rest. It is why you might take an extra shift to try to get ahead and help your family out. The idea is that those who choose work over leisure reap material rewards. And when we have too much redistribution, it blunts the incentives and can make society poorer overall. This is why everybody debates, what are the work incentives? But what happens to the incentives if human labor becomes only weakly connected or even disconnected from the returns to a more prosperous life? Do we still have an equity efficiency trade-off? Will we face the same kind of trade-off between enlarging the pie and giving people more equal slices, or will the structure of the trade-off itself be transformed? And the reason I think I want to raise this question, even though I cannot tell you the answer, is because if we go into all of our policymaking on AI, assuming that it all worked the way it did before, that we have to be kind of beat like a horse to continue to get us to work hard so that we will continue to have economic growth, and that actually doesn't work anymore, we will make bad policy choices. And we will actually lose the benefits of AI. We will lose the benefits of growth. If the growth is not coming from human labor, then incentivizing all the people to work doesn't actually help. So centuries of thinking about what motivates economic activity may itself be undone by this revolution in AI. So then what might actually matter? Well, there are outliers. All those countries I showed you that have gotten happier over time if they've gotten richer, we are sitting in the exception. The United States has not gotten any happier for 50 years. And in fact, people are not very happy today. Newsflash. Maybe you didn't need me to tell you that this is not a time of profound American well-being. Americans are mad and grumpy and yelling at each other and really not too happy these days. Of course, that jumped up during the pandemic, but it hasn't completely receded, and you'll notice that it was trending up long before the pandemic. What's going on? Well, before the pandemic, before we thought, well, maybe it's just that, the economy's not that great. Unhappiness rises with unemployment. And here's a chart. This is from my Principles of Economics textbook, and I had to decide for the third edition whether I take this out, because what you can see is before about 2020, you had a pretty tight relationship between unhappiness and unemployment. Unemployment up, unhappiness up. Unemployment down, unhappiness down. The relationship's totally broken now. Unemployment is low. It's not helping on an unhappiness perspective. So something's going wrong that has nothing to do with jobs. So what's going wrong? Well, what might give us a little bit of insight is the fact that I've been talking about hedonic measures of well-being, and eudaimonic measures of well-being have a less clear relationship with income. So what's the difference between hedonism versus I always mispronounce that name, eudaimonic measures of well-being? So psychologists describe two distinct concepts, and they revolve around distinct philosophies. So one is really about sort of happiness. You guys all know what hedonism is. And the other one is more about purpose, right? It's about knowing what you're doing on this planet every day, knowing your place in the community, what man's quest for meaning, right, is more about the actualization of humans' potentials, feeling proud, productive. I often think of it as what makes a kindergartner have a great day in kindergarten, right? Feeling proud of what you did, feeling like you learned something, feeling like you belonged in your community. So here, this is this hedonism-based measure, just pure enjoyment. And you see a very similar relationship to what I showed you with happiness or life satisfaction. Do you enjoy yourself yesterday? But when we move beyond hedonism, things start to look very different. Do you feel your life has an important purpose or meaning? It's negatively related across countries' GDP. What's going on? So all these people have been telling me we can't take people's jobs. Jobs are where all the meaning comes from. There's something not quite right there. I don't want to put even too much stock into this being a negative relationship. It is very overwhelming for me that it's negative. But I think we can all agree it's not positive. There's nothing that says that more money is going to lead you to feel like you have a much more meaningful or purposeful life. Maybe one reason is because more money doesn't make you feel more proud of something you did the day before. And you still experience a lot of boredom in rich countries. And you're not even that more likely to say you learned something or did something interesting just because you're in a wealthier country. And worry's also kind of flat. It happens across all the countries. So this idea of meaning or purpose, the Japanese have a word for it called ikigai, which is kind of literally translated as the worth of living. And it is the The source or object of one's ikigai is different from the feeling it evokes. Now, some of you may have heard of this concept of ikigai because it gained a lot of popularity in the last few decades from some Westerners who came up with this Venn diagram of ikigai, which says, like at the intersection of what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for, we get your ikigai. I call this ikigai for knowledge workers because this is not what ikigai is all about, right? Ikigai does not require being paid. And I had the pleasure of going to Tokyo this summer to discuss a paper on ikigai. The Japanese government just fielded a recent survey. And I love this quote. When asked what their ikigai was, they gave us explicit answers such as their friends, gardening, art. Everyone knows what their zest for life is and is busily engaged in it every day. So this idea of ikigai, they went out and then surveyed it in Japan. And what they found is there is some relationship between life satisfaction and ikigai, but employment is not statistically significantly related to ikigai and Japanese survey data. And that matches recent data in the United States, which showed that meaning and purpose rose for low-wage workers once they became eligible for Social Security and retired. So this idea that your work delivers meaning, I am happy for all of you. That is great for you. That is not what's happening for most American workers. And if we want to think about how AI is going to change our life, we just need to keep that in mind, that what is related to meaning and purpose is our connections to each other in community. And maybe now you'll start to get a sense of what could be going wrong in the United States, which is what they found in the Japanese survey data, was that frequent participation in volunteer activities and community events correlated with a higher ikigai. The people with the lowest ikigai had almost no civic organizational memberships, and the people with the most had the highest ikigais. Ikigai appears related to emotional and relational dimensions of well-being. So you don't need to work to have meaning and purpose, but you do need to identify what your meaning and purpose is and pursue it. So the last sort of happiness fact that I want to be able to address is that I found in my research that globally women saw their happiness decline relative to men in the 20th century, even as they made all sorts of strides in equality. So happiness declined, and that pattern was pretty pervasive. But I think that it is worth keeping in mind that this raises a lot of questions about what does it mean to be happy and where does meaning come from? The pattern's not easily explained by changes in specific domains of well-being like health or work satisfaction or family life. It wasn't different for women who chose to stay home or who were in more conservative communities or who were more religious. But what we did see is that as civic engagement has declined in the United States, women's happiness has declined more than men's. And so maybe it has nothing to do with work whatsoever. And in that, if you turn to what feminists were saying about the struggles that women had with meaning in the 60s and 70s that sort of, led to the problem with no name, the idea was that you need to find space for community relationships. And I really like this quote from Germaine Greer: "I didn't fight to get women out from behind vacuum cleaners to get them on the board of Hoover." So it wasn't that meaning only comes from paid work. Technological change, which is what pushed women out of the home primarily, created a crisis of meaning, but the answer wasn't necessarily more work. So I'm I'm going to end with, first of all, I want to redo that Venn diagram of Ikigai in an age of AI. What you love, hobbies, causes, people, nature, ideas that bring joy, pets. What you're good at, skills like listening, organizing, storytelling, making others laugh, knowledge about plants, patience. What the world needs, emotional labor, community care, mentorship, activism, cultural preservation. What you can be paid for? No. What your community values. What your community values. Non-monetary rewards such as recognition, respect, gratitude, and love are really an important part of finding your Ikigai. So in summary, income is good. It improves happiness and welfare, but there are diminishing returns. Income doesn't have to make us happier. There are other things that matter for well-being. Meaning and purpose do not rely on jobs. Many people with jobs have no Ikigai, and many people with loads of Ikigai have no jobs. In every scenario I laid out at the beginning, jobs will be unrecognizable in a century. The difference between labor augmenting and labor replacing is about people's ability to shift away from declining opportunities and find new ones in real time. It's about the scope and the pace of the change. And how people react to the post-artificial general intelligence world will depend on the choices we make along the way. We need answers to 3 really important questions. How can ordinary people seek a better life in a world of AI? What will it mean to strive? How will we strive? How will we distribute resources? What will be the primary thing that people get rewarded for? Is it their data? If it's not their labor, is data our new form of labor? Where will people get meaning and purpose? How will we build back the town center and the hearts of communities? I think the policy that's needed now is to reshape the conversation around whether we will lose jobs into one that focuses on managing the speed and process of job transformation. And there are ways we can do that. For instance, we could lower taxation on human workers, which discourages the hiring of people, and raise taxation on capital investments like AI, not just the sort of proposed robot tax, but even sort of a more general shift away from taxing people to taxing capital and other forms of sort of capital-generated, non-labor-generated income. Recognize the important role that humans have historically played and will continue to play in generating the data on which artificial intelligence relies, and shore up the bonds of reciprocity and trust within society so that people experience AI-enabled prosperity, not as something done to them by distant systems, but as a shared project that affirms their place in the social contract. Thank you. Okay.
Professor Stevenson for that very, very lovely talk. Really thought-provoking. So just as a reminder to those of you in the audience, some of you have done this already, but there is a QR code at your tables that you can scan where you'll get access to the digital app on your phone. Well, it's not an app, it's a website, but you can get access to the digital website on your phone where you can submit questions anonymously. So we already have a fair number of questions here. Let me just go through. Let's see. I'll just pick the top one here with those, which has 7 upvotes. How do we maximize the societal benefits of AI in an equitable way at a policy level? It seems like it's supercharging inequalities. There are lots of policy questions that are kind of along similar lines. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is, this distribution issue is really important. I recently wrote something on building out a data dividend. I think that we have to start paying people for their data. If you think about, what happened with the steam engine is our human strength became less valuable, but then human intellect became more valuable. And now human strength isn't as valuable, human intellect won't be as valuable, but our data is very valuable. I also think that all of these systems are built on a wealth of knowledge that really is in the public common, and we really should think about how will we redistribute, who gets access to that public common, and then do we find a way to monetize that access that provides dividends for people? I mean, a lot of people talk about a UBI. I want to make sure that we focus the conversation on a way that's about what people deserve and what they've kind of earned, rather than thinking, boy, you're hopeless, let's just give you some cash. I really want us to try to think about what does it mean to make a contribution, and what are the ways we can reward people for that contribution. And then there's also just this fundamental question of, can you set a baseline for everyone where you're wealthy enough? And if we're not as worried about the equity efficiency trade-off in particular, maybe we can stop having hearings over whether you need a parent to work in order to get a child tax credit, but maybe just, we're not seeing, to put it in technical language, the elasticity isn't there. It's not going to motivate any work. So that should give us a freedom to do redistribution that we've not been able to do before.
All right, thank you for that. Next question we have here. When you say AI is not replacing jobs, because new jobs such as pet therapy are opening up, do you not think it's hard for a specialized person to be replaced by AI and then having to learn a new skill?
I absolutely think it's hard for anybody who has trained up with a certain set of skills to find that their skills are no longer needed. But I wasn't trying to be sarcastic, was sort of pet therapy, and that came out because I was thinking about, like, if I got a chance to pull my grandmother, out of the grave and have a conversation with her about the way the world has evolved, she'd be totally shocked about the jobs that are here. And we can't imagine what the new jobs will be. So when I say that what matters is the speed and scope, it's absolutely because you can't have people have their human capital go to zero overnight. So we've got to slow things down in a way that people have time to adapt. And, I think everybody, even with specialized skills, understands, that I stay on top of my skills every day because the adaptability is the most important skill in the U.S. labor market, and it has been now for quite a long time.
Yeah, I hear lots of people talking about slowing down as a response to how quickly things are changing. Okay, we got another one here. 6 folks. What is your opinion on the future of an AI bubble, similar to the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s?
So, this is a financial markets question more than like what's really going on. But let me draw a couple distinctions. So first of all, if you look at the internet bubble, what was obvious about it being a bubble was there was some sort of weird belief that if you just built customers, then you would dominate the market. So it was really this idea that what I got to do is outlast all the other guys, and then I will emerge as, the Amazon of pet food. And, as a result, all through graduate school, my cat was subsidized by pets.com that kept sending us free stuff because it kept thinking it would just hold on to me as a customer forever. And if it kept sending me, $30 off a $30 order, that's no way to make money. And that's why we had that dot-com bubbles. Everybody's trying to bet on who's going to be the next big winner. And they don't have a real business model underlying them. They're just gambling that if they can hold out the longest. So I wasn't surprised to see that collapse. I don't think that's what's going on with AI, but I do think financial markets might be getting ahead of the returns. So if what you think is we're going to see this huge boost in productivity in the next 2 years, and then you want to say, okay, well, let's make these investments today because everybody's going to have these great returns, in the very short run. And then I think that the returns to AI, I think is going to play out slower. Even if government doesn't do anything, I think that there are, humans are just slow to adapt. And I talk to business leaders all the time who are like, we have this new AI, but we're not really producing output much faster. We're not seeing it in the productivity numbers right now. So I think that there's a possibility for a stock market correction that is not the same thing as AI not being real and not leading to real productivity gains down the line. The stock market is making bets on not only what will productivity gains look like over time, but what is the shape of that path look like. And I think they're betting on them coming earlier than they'll likely come. So that could be a bubble, but I think the companies who think this is a bubble, we don't need to get involved in AI, I think they're actually also going to be hurt. And so the job, if you're, I sit on the board of a public company. Our job is to say, ignore the bubble and think about what are the real productivity gains we can actually get by making changes to use this technology.
Right. And that actually spoke a little bit about bottlenecks and the speed of change. Here's a related question, slightly different direction. From your economist point of view, what are the bottlenecks for policy changes to happen fast? I think the folks are probably wondering about some of the policy implications of some of the results you were showing, and what are some of the bottlenecks to potentially see some of those implemented? Who are the deciders in that process?
There's a lot of bottlenecks in that process right now. And I think that's the thing that makes me the least optimistic. Is one, I think we need some global conversations, global minimum tax would be a good idea. We had one negotiated, but we haven't been able to implement it. We're not in a great situation in terms of our relationships with other countries right now. And so it's a bad time to be trying to navigate a lot of these issues in any kind of global international context. So that's bottleneck number one. Bottleneck number two is trust is at an all-time low in the United States. All sorts of trust, interpersonal trust, trust in government, trust in the law, trust in universities, you name it, trust is in the toilet. And how can we come together collaboratively and decide what kind of structural changes we want or how we're going to prepare ourselves for this when we don't trust the people that we are supposed to be collaborating with? And I think that's the biggest bottleneck is you have, the way it should work is members of Congress should come together and negotiate with each other. But there's just a lot of partisanship right now. And we're also in a situation where individual companies are achieving a lot through personal negotiation, and that is never a good way to see policy adapt to a rapidly changing environment.
All right, we have time for one more. I was looking over there to see if we had any in-person question, folks, and I don't see any. So I'll just end with this one. Can you please comment on how our society will preserve its intelligence and critical thinking abilities while in a modern AI-enhanced society it doesn't seem necessary anymore?
Oh, what a great question to end on. And I think it's actually probably the most critical question, which is what are the incentives to think if there's a machine that thinks for you? Because thinking is uncomfortable sometimes and it's hard. And I think that that's one of the, in that man's quest for meaning, right? I think one of the answers is thinking is part of being alive. And so hopefully there's some innate incentives, but I do think it's also worth thinking about how we build, the incentives for engaging and thinking into the system. And that might mean, yes, we need to learn how to use AI, but we might want to keep our students away from it as they're developing their brains and thinking. And I think this is something we've sort of learned the hard way with social media and what it's done to our kids. We probably should be a little more proactive when it comes to AI.